Welcome to Paradigms at paradigms.life, the radio show and podcast that brings you inspiring people with visions of a viable future for life on Earth that includes humans. Hi, I'm Baruch, host of Paradigms. Thanks for tuning in. In this episode, we're welcoming back a guest. Been having lots of wonderful folks returning to the show lately. It's so great to see what projects people are doing, and this one is no exception. We're going to talk with a guy who's been working on this musical project for years, with many players, many iterations, all focused on the teachings of a man who traveled in the 1300s and what he learned. Intrigued? All right, let's meet my guest right now on this episode of Paradigms. Bernard O'Neill, welcome back to Paradigms.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being back.
It's good to talk with you. You have been working on this Syriana project in various iterations for a number of years, and now you've released a new recording.
Yes.
1325.
That's correct.
And it is really spectacular. You have added so many instruments and singers and musicians and depth and dimension to this material. It's really quite striking.
Thank you.
Since you were on last with sort of the initial Syriana, the releases that you had done as benefit for Syria,
yeah,
what led to this next iteration, and what was the process like?
Well, it goes back actually to a flight from London to Damascus in 2009. It's a long flight on Syrian Airlines, which no longer exists, by the way. So my wife had gone to the local charity shop and had bought me a couple of books to read. One of the books was an Arabist called Tim McIntosh Smith, who was writing then a short account of a journey he had done in the footsteps of a man called Ibn Battuta. And Ibn Battuta is relatively unknown in the West. He is a huge figure in the Arab world. He is the most important person in Moroccan history, originally from Tangiers. And in 1325, at the age of 21, he set out on what was going to be a 27-year journey. And he traveled across North Africa. He studied jurisprudence in Damascus. That was his father's wishes, and his father had paid for him to go there. And thereafter, he was supposed to do the Hajj. But circumstances changed, and he had become a wadi. He had become an Islamic judge. His timing was excellent because at that particular point in time, in the early part of the 14th century, the Islamic world was quite big and was getting bigger. And so I read this book, and I was absolutely captivated by that part of the story. And Nick and I discussed it on the way back. I'd finished the book and we were talking about it. And I said, this is an interesting concept, the idea that someone can leave Tangier and travel for 27 years and then come back and write his memoirs. But more importantly, the fact that this man had actually set out on this journey without any passport or planning or credit cards or anything like that. And it basically created something which the book, by the way, is still published to this day in Arabic. And I read the translation then that Tim McIntosh Smith, which is the Travels of Ibn Battuta, in order to expand my knowledge on it and also then in order to start the process of recording the project. And by this time, Syriana was Nick and I, because we had sort of done the first album, and the album had done relatively well with Real World, and we then did various other offshoots of it. Any sort of remixes we did for example, Natasha Atlas or any of the other Arabic artists, we put it under the umbrella name Syriana. So the next album obviously was going to be something which had to have a good story. And in the meantime, Nick and I had left the UK. He had gone to Spain and I'd gone to France. And we were still working because, you know, it's a very, very short plane ride between Malaga and Toulouse. So circumstances became difficult with Nick becoming ill. We then struggled through COVID. But remarkably, the project had incredible legs. You know, every time a problem presented itself, it was rectified by someone or something came about to create an even better result. And musicians suggested themselves. Obviously, we learned a lot of lessons from the first Syriana album. And one of those lessons was get singers in, don't rely on one singer. The second lesson we learned was if you're going to have singers sing, have them sing in their own language. The exception to that, however, was Esbe, who was a very, very old friend of Nick's and who had trained as an opera singer and was a very versatile singer. And so the direct translations of some of Ibn Battuta's own quotes that I turned into song, I got another friend of mine who is a linguist historian in Madrid to translate into the Spanish of the 14th century, Sephardic Spanish. So Esbe sang two songs in Spanish because Ibn Battuta visited Spain. He went to Granada. So the whole thing was basically geographically fixed to where the singers came from, and the main thrust of that was there was no English. So we have Kurdish, Turkish, Portuguese. We've got Moroccan Arabic, French, and Spanish. And so the whole idea was that we would communicate through the language of the singer, and that would then present a geographical pinpoint as to you join the dots as to where Ibn Battuta had been. And the last song on the album did change because with the death of Nick, Natasha rang me and said, I don't feel right about singing, you know, the subject matter that we've started out at. She said it really should be a reflection on our relationship to Nick. And it was, you know, so she changed the words. And so it's contemporary Arabic. It means if you were here. So that was basically the premise of which the album was based on. It was very loose, but the great thing was, along the way, we had worked for a very, very many years in sort of the Middle East and North Africa, and we had quite an address book of musicians to call upon. And various people then presented themselves along the way just by accident. And so, although it does look like a cast of thousands, it was very, very much predicated on a lot of goodwill and people using their time during lockdown to record in their own places. Or in the case of Matthias Turides, who doesn't have a recording facility in his own house, he waited until the first day that the recording studios were open in Greece, and he drove through the night to Athens, where he had booked the best studio in Athens in order to record the two pieces that he played on. So there was a huge amount of enthusiasm and a huge amount of purpose. People saw it as an important thing. More to that, there was a huge amount of serendipity. I mean, I went to Morocco to record as part of this. The opening section is the musicians, the Sufi musicians in Meknes. These are the royal musicians who play for the king. They're an extraordinary bunch of men. They all have day jobs. And I had met them the year beforehand through my friend Simon Webster, who I was working with today. He then was working and living in Morocco, and he introduced me to these guys. They came around to play in his riad. I asked them, if I write some music for you, could you interpret it? And they did. So I went and I recorded with them. And that was very important because I actually was able to spend a whole 2 weeks going around talking to people about Ibn Battuta. I went to a very, very important town, Moula Idris. It is the most important town in Islam in Morocco. It was where the first man who introduced Islam to Morocco was based. I'm sitting in the square, you know, just taking things in. This town hasn't changed an awful lot in 1,000 years. The man beside me turned to me and said, in French, what are you doing here? And I said, I've come to trace the steps of Ibn Battuta. And he looked at me and he said, this is incredible. He said, I'm the imam of the mosque. I was talking to the school children about Ibn Battuta today. What do you want to know?
I'm talking with Bernard O'Neill about the new record Syriana 1325, the next iteration of the Syriana project, which celebrates the journey of Ibn Battuta in the 1300s from Morocco to Tibet and back. Let's hear some of the new music now, and then we'll be back with more of my conversation with Bernard O'Neill. This one is called Fis et Antalya, from the new record Syriana 1325. This is Paradigms at paradigms.life.
سلام
Feast at Antalya. That's from the new album Syriana 1325, the latest iteration of this wonderful project, Syriana. That's some really moving music. That is going to make you get up and move and wake up. All right, let's get back to my conversation now with Bernard O'Neill. Talk to me more about Ibn Battuta. Tell me more about his significance.
Ibn Battuta is someone who, in the world of North Africa and of the Arab lands, is a hero, someone who has achieved a great deal. He's a character. The fact that he wrote his memoirs towards the end of his life, a lot of people said, well, he's made it all up like Marco Polo. Well, actually, he didn't. And what's very interesting, when you understand the studies that have been done of him, you realize that he had a phenomenal memory. In those days, because of his position as a judge, a lot of his stuff was written down. So there is actually a lot of documentary evidence. And then, of course, you've got the situation where he describes in his book people and places from the perspective of a guy who's been born in Tangier and who's now finds himself at the far-flung reaches of India towards the Chinese border, or in Turkmenistan, a country which was then assuming Islam, or in Spain. He very often found himself in a situation where he had to mediate between principalities over land disputes and this type of thing. So there's a huge amount of humanity in his writing. He describes, for example, the women who looked after him, his slave women. You have to remember that in those days, that was part and parcel of the caravan. You actually had an entourage that traveled with you. He also describes how people's experiences that were beyond his comprehension, he made it his business to find out about people. He made it his business to understand social classes and social situations in other cultures. He doesn't actually make judgments on that, but he's very, very clear. And unfortunately, what's actually happened in the West, an awful lot of the interpretation of what he actually said has been, in some ways, been reported as it would be on Fox News. It's a little bit controversial. But the fact of the matter is, when you scratch below the surface, you realize that his book is very enlightened and it's incredibly humane. It's also the case that he recognizes humanity in all the places that he visits. Doesn't necessarily follow his rules because he was a fairly traditional Islamic man of his time, but he takes account of their individuality. And I think that's something which is very much celebrated in his book.
Sounds like he offers us some perspective we could use today.
Very much so. And also he offers a perspective in terms of the long view. And we don't often have the ability to understand what someone's mind was like 700 years ago. But he very much is someone who takes the long view and views what's happened before and what will happen to come.
That's especially significant right now because people are taking a shorter and shorter view.
Yeah.
Like this music, the various iterations of humanity through time, so much has been learned and forgotten, and that we find ourselves having to relearn it through the same hardships or worse.
Yeah.
Current events, current situations very much exemplify that.
Yeah. The other thing which is quite interesting, Nick and I had a lot of debate as to what instruments we would use. It's very easy when you put your musician's head on and go back to the 14th century to think of early music. And so an awful lot of the composing that I did, and the way it worked was I would actually write something and then send it to Nick and he would go, yes, no, what about this? And he would make a judgment. I, on purpose, used an awful lot of early music instruments initially in order to, if you like, find color. And then thereafter they were changed so that it didn't actually sound like some sort of pastiche Palestrina album. It actually had to have some connection with the time in between the 14th century and now.
Oh, yeah, you could hear contemporary instrumentation.
Yeah. And so that was quite important. The other thing that was important was that within the instruments that we chose from the regions that he visited, we needed to make sure that we didn't fall into cliche. So, for example, a very good example of that is Umit Kayhan, who's singing the only male voice on the album. He's singing as the old man, Ibn Battuta, recounting his stories. Umit sort of said to me, I'm going to use a couple of different Kurdish traditional instruments, saz, but he said, I might have a bit of a surprise for you. And he did. He actually, his daughter, Emily, who was 14 at the time, was studying at the Conservatoire in Toulouse. And so she accompanies him as well on a contemporary classical guitar. And thereafter, then I added both psaltery and double bass and percussion to that track. So there were instances where there were happy results which came about by accident.
We'll be back with more of my conversation with Bernard O'Neill after we listen to another track from this new record, Syriana, 1325. This is very different from what we heard earlier. This is much more contemplative. It's called Garnata, Fountain of Tears. from the new Syriana 1325 album, that's Garnata, Fountain of Tears. And now let's get back to my conversation with Bernard O'Neill, talk some more about this music and Ibn Battuta. That explains some of the incredible haunting feeling throughout this record. I mean, the earlier stuff is wonderful, don't get me wrong. This takes it to a whole new level of emotion and texture and color and dimension, and it's like going from looking at a photograph to looking at a hologram.
Right. Okay. That's nice. Well, it's also the case that we had more time and more planning went into this, insofar as the melodies that I wrote suggested certain instruments. A very good example of that is the duduk player, Harutian, who's head of woodwind studies at Yerevan University. He came about through a very, very long-term connection from London. I had been trying to find a duduk player in France. And of course, all the duduk players in France are incredibly well connected and weren't really willing to work, on a project which they didn't recognize. This guy was completely and utterly open. And I sent him the track, which he returned, played absolutely beautifully. And then I asked him, I said, listen, could you just do an improvisation, around this, because it's going to be used, and it certainly was. So there's a lot of excellence in people's playing, which really, really helps. I mean, having someone like Kalia Liraki makes a huge difference because, she's a brilliant flautist. And then having Mazen Abu Saif from Syria playing accordion and ney and violin, you've got the real deal there. And that was one of the great aspects of this album, was we were able to call upon a whole host of people who had come to us as a result of the first album and had become known to us as a result of the first album. And then with Nick's passing, an awful lot of people came forward. For example, I didn't have all the guitars done. Nick had passed before he'd done all the guitars. So I was able to contact all Nick's favorite guitar players. And so Andrew McPherson in Canada, and Dave Malloy in Ireland, and Richard Bolton and Neil Stacey all came good and all said, yeah, we'll do that. So that was great. After I had everything, I had a ridiculous task of trying to sift through everything, because the album is 14 tracks long, but there's another 6 tracks that haven't been released. So it was very, very difficult to actually pinpoint what was going to be the release initially,
I can only imagine the amount of files you're juggling and setting up timelines in your workstation and getting, it must have been, I'm imagining there must have been moments where you went, this is so much stuff.
Well, I had to leave it at times. I had to leave it and go away and then come back to it and be judicious about what was staying, what was going. And also the mixing. I've got my 3 wise men, people like Jeff Westley and Haji Mike and Paul Downing, who listen to my stuff and I trust what they say. That was great, just being able to bounce it off people who have got ears.
And it's also an homage to Nick.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I mean, it's something which he would have wanted to have been more involved in. And unfortunately, things didn't work out that way. So I had to keep very much one eye on that. Luckily, having worked with him as long as I did, I was able to second guess an awful lot of the things that he would have suggested.
I think for listeners, just to imagine that you have a musical partner you work with for a long, long time, and then they pass, and what a change that is in your life, in your creative life, in your personal life. Just wanting to acknowledge that.
Very much so. Very much so. And it's also the case, when you've actually been working with someone, like we did a lot of work. So very often we'd have talked 2 or 3 times a day, and we'd various, projects coming and going. So yeah, it's a huge hole. It's a huge hole.
We've got more conversation coming up after we hear this track from Syriana 1325. It's called Qasr al-Zafia Wedding. You're listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life,
وبراسمان ومدودين يصم اللودة العين محدورين سول ونرجع شوفتو هنا مسافير الدم شكون يعرف المكتوب اللي مكتب له وبراس سبحان ومدودين يصم اللودة العين محدورين سول ونرجع جاوبتو إنا مسافير الدم شكون يعرف المكتوب اللي مكتب له هات سكتي قلت وين هات سكتي قلت وين ما تحكي لي وهو هات Le bout de ses doigts tendus en dessine un adieu. Ses yeux baissés ont demandé quand je reviendrai. Et j'ai répondu quel voyageur est sorti. Qui connaît le destin qu'on lui a donné. Ce silence en dit long. Ce silence en dit long, il ne m'apprend rien. كيفاش عارف الحياة اللي عايش أحسن من هادي اللي جاية. كيفاش عارف الحياة اللي عايش أحسن من هادي اللي جاية. وشكون اللي عارف المكتوب اللي مكتب له. Ce silence, ce silence, ce silence en dit long. Ce silence, ce silence en dit long. Ce silence, ce silence, ce silence. Ce silence en dit long.
Qasr al-Zafia Wedding from the new Syriana 1325 album. All right, here's the next part of my conversation with Bernard O'Neill. Because you've been doing all this learning about Ibn Battuta and the region and Islam and history and all of this stuff, and of course, you know, we see the state of the world right now. We see what's happening in North Africa. I try to refer to it as North Africa. Middle East seems like a colonial term that I don't understand why it's called that. So I just think of it all as North Africa because that's actually what it is. You know, the so-called East and the so-called West are so bifurcated. There's so much political and cultural polarization that is, I just think of as, sort of the ultimate human foolishness. But it's what we do. It's what we've been doing for a long time. With what you've been learning, with the immersion in the music and the culture, with your travels, I'm just wondering, what do you think about all of this, and what do you see, and what thoughts do you have about ways that humanity can get through this?
I think something which is very clear is the situation which we now face in the early part of 2024 has not changed an awful lot in over 200 years. That's the first thing. The situation that I see is that the biggest mistake that has ever been perpetrated in North Africa was the imposition of borders, because you don't actually have borders. That's the first thing. Second thing is, Ibn Battuta lived in a world where there were very, very distinct cultural differences, but they weren't necessarily assigned to geographical areas. And what you notice when you go and work in North Africa is that, for example, I spent the month of October last working with musicians from Iran and Iraq in Germany. The issues which were dealt with in that project was the arrival in Germany of Persian engineers in the 1960s and 1970s, because the Germans needed more engineers, and they invited these engineers and their families to come to the Ruhr. And the Ruhr then was post-war, massive industrial zone, heavily polluted, very noisy, steelworks, everything. The cultural change for the people who came from Persia must have been astounding. And yet they coped with that. They kept the culture with them. And when you talk to their children, which are the people I was actually working with, you realize that people are incredibly adaptable. The problem arises when the people who make decisions impose ideas from top down. One of the things which I've recognized, because I've lived in 3 different countries, I actually lived for particular long periods of time in 3 different countries. It doesn't necessarily matter where you come from. It doesn't necessarily matter what culture you have. What you have to look at is globally how people get along. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a little French village, or whether you're in Palestine, or whether you're in Persia, or whether you're in Germany. People are people. The problem arises when politicians start telling people what to do. And culture, by the nature of it being something human, grows. It doesn't stay still. People adapt. They adapt language, they adapt dance, they adapt all manner of things depending on where they are. And when you start saying to people, oh, you must preserve X, Y, and Z in your culture, it's nonsense, because you might as well then stick that into a museum. That's what museums are for, to looking back. So people in general have a positive attitude. Ibn Battuta was a very positive person. That's what kept him going all that time. It didn't matter where he was, whether he was in Timbuktu or Grenada. He was still the same guy. He was still doing the same job. I think the problem now is, because of modern communication and social media, and because of our reluctance to accept things on face value, now it's more important for us who actually do some cultural thinking to reflect on things with a certain degree of truth, because it certainly isn't the case that we're getting it from anything else.
Just the word truth has become a loaded word.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So if you take a cultural result, such as, this album, there are aspects of this album where you bend culture in order to facilitate an end result. But the bottom line is, the guys who are singing on the very, very first opening seconds of the album are singing a piece of music which has been sung by them for over 600 years, the same way. You can't get away from that.
We'll be back with the final part of my conversation with Bernard O'Neill after we hear one more track from Syriana 1325. This one's called Daili Tukinbaya. Daili Tukinbaya from the new record Syriana 1325. The music really taking us on Ibn Battuta's journey. All right, here is the final part of my conversation with Bernard O'Neill. We need to honor and keep and love our traditions without being married to them staying the same, that they are not actually written in stone. But what happens is when people feel afraid that they're going to be disenfranchised, they cling more tightly to dogma and doctrine and become rigid.
Yeah, very much so.
And this is what we're seeing. And the other thing you said was people are people. And then the politicians came in, and what through my mind is, well, are politicians people? They certainly all start out that way. But what happens to a human being when they're put in a position of power over that really screws up their morality, their ability to relate with others, and their sense of being part of? And I think we have to actually address this, because our model is deeply flawed when we elevate people into positions of power, or when we allow people to amass enormous hordes that are so disproportionate it's beyond measure. That is sort of like, if you think of humanity as one body, those are the cancer cells, you know, and we have to actually deal with it. And we're still not.
I think so. I think it's also the case that because the goalposts move so quickly, there is a lack of focus. I think it's become, in certain circumstances, people have become punch drunk because they really don't know where to look. I think there's a lack of clarity. I think that's purposefully been done. And I think it's also the case that the last couple of years, so since 2020, there has been a huge upheaval in humanity. First COVID, then the Ukraine war, and now the situation in Palestine. And it would appear that the gap between the politicians and the real people is now wider than ever. And it's also the case that people are now beginning, in some places, to question. It's been so easy to program people. Someone said to me quite recently, the word program used for a TV presentation is no accident.
Of course not.
I think it's been very carefully done in the last 60, 70 years, that the use of television in particular, because of its ability to shock with image and sound, had far more effect than radio.
The consumer of it is hit on literally more levels neurologically. I mean, it's a whole lot more stimulation.
Yeah. And so in some ways, I think the thought process of being able to analyze what's going on in front of you becomes quite difficult. It's so easy to knee-jerk, but at the same time, it's very difficult to get a global view of what's going on because there's just so much information. And I think where people have become maybe disenfranchised, that has been done by the politicians in order to dissipate energy. I think there's a huge amount of control. And in some ways, the problem that we have as musicians is the world is moving so fast now, and the control over broadcast and what is actually achievable in terms of getting your stuff out there has become harder because of the controls that are exercised by the big multinational news organizations.
Another figure that came out of that part of the world more recently was George Gurdjieff, who also talked very much about people being robots and how important it is for people to wake up and not be on autopilot. And this is 100 years ago he's talking about that. And now we literally see people walking around like robots, looking at their little device that's telling them what to do and where to go and what to think. And we've got to get through this.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to take a long time. And again, this is the ability to take the long view and to plan the long view is something which is very difficult because people are encouraged to do something immediately.
Well, they're infantilized because small children are the ones who insist on immediate gratification. I mean,
that's right. Yeah.
We used to consider the ability to tolerate delayed gratification part of being an adult. No one's talking about that anymore. The adults are wearing pajamas in the airport.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. So I think the hardest thing in some ways will be to rein in the excesses which have been let out there. And I think it's going to take a while before people return to prioritizing the things that are important. I think that's going to take a while. I think that those who have made these situations possible have thrown a whole lot of stuff up in the air. And I think it's incumbent upon the artistic community, who they hate, by the way. It's incumbent upon the artistic community to keep at it.
What happens next with the record?
Interestingly enough, yesterday, Songlines published a very extensive article by Robin Denslow on the record. And they said to me that they're going to do a review in their next issue. Hopefully that'll be sufficient to, get people engaged. There is a very limited edition of 250 CDs, which is going to be for sale. The rest of the sales are digital through Bandcamp or through 6 Degrees Records in the States. Bob Duskus, who is a very close friend of Nick's, offered to do the digital distribution. So that's going there. That's pretty well it. I think it's being published by Real World, so they would hope to get it out and, to place the music in film and TV and that type of thing.
And if I haven't said it yet, I want to say this music is just lovely. It's haunting. It's beautiful. It's surprising. You did some sort of jazzy atonality stuff that I didn't expect. Not that
Good.
I had big expectations. I didn't. I came in with an open mind, but it was like, ooh, and it's very different from the earlier iterations of Syriana.
Yes. Yes.
And it feels like the fruit has ripened.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. It was a long time in coming, but I think the preparation and the study that we made from the first album, we were able to expand on that. We were able to look at the possibility, because of the travels of Ibn Battuta, we had an excuse to be able to expand the horizon. In doing so, what was interesting, the interpretation from the Arab musicians on the album was that of, in their mind's eye, they're interpreting something that is about a great hero in their culture. The Western musicians, I had to give them a potted history in advance to explain what was going on. And so that's quite interesting, because you've got Western and Eastern musicians meeting on certain tracks. The fact is, they were never in the same studio. They're recording in separate studios, and you just wouldn't know.
Yeah.
That's the great aspect of this.
That's a tribute to the musicians and to the engineers.
Yeah.
You did the mix is amazing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let's hope that this reaches a lot of people, and that a lot of people are inspired to learn more about Ibn Battuta and his perspective. His journey itself is of great relevance, but even more important than that is how he, as a person, adapted himself, brought himself to different places, was himself, but also participated with what was there, instead of having to have it be a fight.
Yeah. Very much so. Very much so. The openness, I think it's the openness of his interpretation of what people are, regardless of where they are geographically. That's the interesting aspect of this.
Well, Bernard, thanks for talking with me about it. I need to go back and listen to this a few more times and let it sink in. And I hope that listeners will do the same. But keep going. You're just, you're on a roll.
Thank you very much. I'll be in touch with the next one.
Good. Absolutely do.
Okay.
Bernard O'Neill, thank you so much for being on Paradigms again and sharing this music with us. The Syriana project just keeps going, and I can't wait to hear what happens next. But this record, 1325, really wonderful. I think part of what is so inspiring about this project is that it's about honoring someone from the past whose story has a lot to offer us in the present. I definitely encourage you to learn more about Ibn Battuta. Very interesting guy. And to listen to the rest of this record, because it's really wonderful. You can hear the whole thing on Bandcamp, bernardoneil.bandcamp.com, along with all the other Syriana albums, because there's a bunch of music that's been released in this series. You can also find Syriana at the Real World website, realworldrecords.com/artists/Syriana. Syriana. Bernard is involved in other musical projects as well. He is just an amazing composer and arranger and bass player and organizer of groups of musicians, be on the lookout for Bernard O'Neill. Bernard, always a pleasure. Can't wait to talk with you again. And if you enjoyed this episode of Paradigms, I hope you'll visit the Paradigms website at paradigms.life, where you'll find all of our episodes archived going back to 2009. At the bottom of that page, you'll find a link to my new audiobook, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, voiced by myself and Starhawk, More Timeless Wisdom. Check that out at theprophet.life. I'm going to leave you with one more track from Syriana 1325. This one's called A Gift to Those Who Contemplate. And let's let that be the word for the week. Contemplate. To focus and think deeply upon something. All right, Baruch signing off for this episode of Paradigms. We'll be back next time with more inspiring people. Until then, let us contemplate and be well.
Gurbet elde yapayalnız kaldın mı anlarsın. Ne derdin dert olunca, arzu halin sen olur. Ne mesut olursun can, ne kendi gölgen olur. Gezerim dünya alemi, cebimde aşk ile. Kalbimde sen varsın can, dilimde özgürlük. Acıyla yorulmuş hayat, dolunay özgürlük.
You've been listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.